Hello there. Today I'm going to be talking about climate change and carbon taxes, which are one way of addressing climate change. Now, climate change is a relatively recent problem, but almost overnight it's become arguably the biggest challenge facing humanity as a species. We have until about 2030 to solve the problem, and there's a lot of concern that we won't be able to meet that deadline. Our track record on this leaves quite a bit to be desired. There's also a lot of uncertainty about what the best way to reduce carbon emissions is. One idea that's being tried right now in about 40 different countries is called a pollution price or a carbon price. Its widespread use is relatively new, but it's based off of a well-understood idea. When there's no cost associated with something, it's free to do, and people will do as much of it as they want to. This is why a lot of countries have lower or no taxes on education and higher taxes on cigarettes. Governments want people to get educated and don't want them to smoke. Looking at this graph of the cost of cigarettes in France compared to the number of smokers and smoking-related deaths, we can see that this tends to work pretty well. As the cost of cigarettes goes up, the number of smokers goes down, and a few years later, so does the number of smoking-related deaths. Putting a price on pollution works the same way. Increasing how much it costs polluters to emit carbon decreases how much they'll be willing to do it. Let's look at how this works in practice. Let's say there's an electricity company operating in Atlantis. One of its power plants is very old and scheduled to be closed down soon, and the company needs to open a new one. There are three options available to them: coal, natural gas, and solar. Now, increasingly, renewables are actually becoming the cheapest option available, but Atlantis has kept themselves secret for so long that a lot of economic and cultural trends haven't made it there yet, including the lower cost of renewables and that a lot of internet Nazis there are still at least claiming to be ironic. Now, the costs of electricity vary quite a bit between the three plants. The coal plant costs $200 per kilowatt hour of energy, the natural gas plant costs $280, and the solar plant $420. The amount of pollution also varies between the three. The coal plant produces 10 tons of carbon pollution per kilowatt hour of energy, the natural gas plant produces 5, and the solar plant only 0.1. The pollution from these plants contributes to the greenhouse effect, which is what's causing climate change. It's impossible to perfectly predict the costs of climate change, but everybody agrees they'll be high. The World Health Organization, for instance, predicts that the climate change will lead to the deaths of about 250,000 people every year between 2030 and 2050. That's 5 million people in total. In addition to that, climate change is already causing billions of dollars of economic damage per year. The poorest parts of the world are seeing some of the worst impacts, and it's only predicted to get worse as time goes on. The cost to human life and the global economy of polluting a single ton of carbon is estimated to be somewhere between a few $100s and several thousand. The median estimate puts it at $417 American, which for simplicity's sake is what we're going to assume is the actual cost of polluting carbon. If we include the cost of pollution associated with each of the power plants, the firm's choice looks like it should be pretty obvious. The solar plant has by far the lowest cost associated with it once you include the cost of pollution. Here's the thing though, Atlantis doesn't have a carbon price. It has some regulations on pollution for local air quality, but as long as you meet those regulations, it's essentially free to pollute as much as you want. This means that pollution is just not a cost that gets factored into the choice the electricity company is making. The company chooses the coal power plant. They're aware of climate change, but it seems to them like a faraway problem, and in the meantime, they have shareholders to please, so they choose the cheapest option available. A year goes by, and another plant is scheduled for decommissioning, but this time things are a little bit different. A young politician noticed what happened last time the power company had to build a new plant. Concerned that rising sea levels might wipe out Atlantean civilization, she proposes legislation that would no longer make pollution free, requiring polluters to pay a tax every time they pollute. It's called a carbon tax, and it's one of the simplest and most popular ways of putting a price on pollution. The tax that's paid is proportionate to the amount that gets polluted. It starts at a modest amount and then increases more as time goes on, so that pollution steadily decreases as the tax increases. Atlantis' carbon price is going to start at $20 per ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent amount of pollution from other greenhouse gases. Over time, though, that will increase so that eventually the tax will equal $417 per ton, which is the actual cost of pollution. At that point, the polluter will be paying the same cost as the people affected by the pollution. Let's look at the decision the electricity company is now facing. The cost of the power plants themselves haven't changed, but it now costs $20 for each ton of CO2 they emit, which is something the company must consider. The coal plant now costs $200 to run per kilowatt hour and $200 from the carbon tax for a total cost of $400 per kilowatt hour. The natural gas plant now costs $380 with an additional $100 coming from the tax, and the solar plant costs $420 with only $2 of that coming from the carbon tax. With a tax of $20 per ton of carbon, it now makes more sense for the company to build a natural gas plant than a coal plant. Making the polluter pay for the emissions they produce themselves has given them a good reason to reduce pollution. This time around, they choose the natural gas plant. Another year passes, and Atlantis needs yet another new power plant. The carbon tax has now increased to $50 per ton. The decision now looks like this. The coal plant now costs $700, $200 from the base cost, and $500 from the tax. The natural gas plant costs $530, with the cost split about evenly between the two. And the solar plant only costs $425, $5 more than it did in the first year. As the cost of pollution moves from the people affected by it to the people creating it, polluters are taking more and more steps to cut emissions, and the company finally chooses to build the solar power plant. Now, the prices and emissions of power plants were fixed in this example, but one of the biggest benefits of carbon taxes is that actually isn't true in practice. Carbon taxes encourage innovation that makes transitioning to a green economy even easier. As it becomes cheaper to pollute less, more investors will want to put money into making dirty technology cleaner and making clean technology cheaper. This means that the pollution from the natural gas plant and the cost of the solar plant would likely have gone down with the tax. So, obviously Atlantis isn't real, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a shill for George Soros. But carbon taxation is effective, and I am definitely saying that because I'm a shill for George Soros. Carbon taxes are by far the most efficient way to address climate change. That's important, both because it makes the transition to a green economy that much easier, and that it allows it to happen more quickly, making the long-term effects of climate change less severe. This has been theoretical so far, but carbon taxes have been put in place in the real world, with very good results. In British Columbia, a carbon tax was introduced in 2008. BC's carbon emissions are now estimated to be between 5 and 15% lower than they would have otherwise. Meanwhile, they had higher levels of economic growth than anywhere in the OECD in the same period. Jobs were lost in industries that produce a lot of pollution, but they were created in others that don't. Sweden introduced its carbon tax in 1991, when a lot of people hadn't even heard about climate change. It's increased over time, and today they have the highest carbon tax rate in the world, about $140 American per ton of pollution. The result is that they have the fourth lowest rate of emissions in Europe, while also maintaining the fourth most productive economy. Carbon taxes aren't going to deal with climate change by themselves, but they're a necessary part of any plan to solve the problem. If we want to deal with climate change by 2030, we need carbon taxes now, we need them to be high, and we need them across the world. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch.